Hello, everyone, and welcome to Transcending Comics. We're a podcast dedicated to trans representation in comic books, manga, and webtoons. And on this panel, we're going behind the scenes. I'm your host, Tommy Trimbath, and joining me today is more queer talent than I think can be safely contained in any one room. First up, from Lifeline Comics, we have Daniel Falco. He's a writer and editor. Their work's been featured in anthologies like By Visibility, Still By, and the recent Kickstarter campaign, Transphoria. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
Next up, we have Kahn, one of my favorite podcasters that regularly challenges the sexy vampire, sexy werewolf binary on the Progressively Horrified podcast, and the writer behind several badass graphic novels like Captain Laserhawk, Crushing Love, Renegade Rule, and Mr. Muffins, Defender of the Stars.
Good to be here. Ben here, they, she, and glad to be a part of this podcast, or glad to be a part of this panel.
Also joining us is Wang, the writer and artist behind the incredible graphic novel of Thunder and Lightning, as well as webcomics like An Eye for an Eye and O Radiant Devil, O Whispering Angel. Welcome back, Kim.
Hello again.
And finally, we're joined by the Stonewall and Ignatz Award-winning author and illustrator behind Genderqueer, as well as Journey's Guide to Healthy Binding and many other zines and short comics, Maia Kobabe.
Hello.
I'll be kicking us off here with just a number of questions for the entire group, and then we'll dedicate the second half of the panel to questions from the audience. But to start us off, just to help everyone else out there that's as bad with names as I am, if you could just remind everyone your name, your pronouns, and tell us your favorite thing you've seen at the con so far, we'll take it from there.
All right, I'll start since I'm next in the lineup. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Falco. I use he, him pronouns, and I've worked for Lifeline Comics on a few anthologies that are very queer-specific. And walking around this FlameCon, there have been so much good art around, and I like picking up a lot of indie books, but I think my favorite thing I passed was somebody who focuses on Reanimator and Jeffrey Combs' filmography pages, which was a very culty 80s horror movie with insane practical effects. So finding one of my favorite bad in quotation marks movies around was very special for me.
Ben, how about you?
Yeah, sorry for jumping the gun on the panel format there. Again, my name is Ben. My pronouns are they, she. I do the Progressively Horrified podcast. I've done comics for Scout, Dark Horse, Simon & Schuster, Tokyo Pop, Oni Press, and I wrote a middle grade prose novel for Scholastic called Elle, Campbell Wins Their Weekend. One non-binary 7th graders quest to escape Saturday detention and trek across town to meet their celebrity hero. And, I've lost count of how many FlameCons I've done, and what keeps me coming back year after year is just the people and the energy. I mean, it's not just like the costumes and the merchandise and the merch and books people make. It is just to have an environment where we can fully embrace not just our nerdy interests, but our identities. I mean, there's plenty of places that are queer accepting, but only FlameCon is queer assuming, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Ben. How about you, Kim?
My name is Kimberly, or you can call me Kim as well. Kim Wang, and my pronouns are they, them. My favorite thing that I've seen at FlameCon today, someone gave me a sticker that says, "Let's go to the Yuri Aquarium," and I want to go. Let's go to the Yuri Aquarium.
And finally, Maya.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maia Kobabe. I use the pronouns EM/air. I have seen so much good stuff, but I think definitely seeing my friends and their newest works is very exciting. So I collabed on a K-pop fanzine, for example, that is at Hazel and Belle and also Kat and Kendra's table. So getting to see that Reza Grafton in person was very special after collabing completely online. But I'm also really into those beanies that look like an orange with a little leaf at the top. So might buy that before the end of the weekend.
Now, in this panel actually marks about the 1-year anniversary of Transcending Comics.
Woo!
And, I appreciate everyone that's been involved in the show so far, our listeners, but to kick off our proper questions, I wanted to ask about, when I first started researching comics for the show, I was immediately overwhelmed with how present and influential trans creators have been in the world of webcomics, literally since their inception. So for those here that partake, I'd love to know how you feel that webcomics have influenced you both as a fan and a creator in the medium.
I mean, I was definitely around reading a lot of those 2000s webcomics, which is now made by trans women in the 2020s. I mean, I got my start. I mean, my first comics were, you know, stuff like 8-Bit Theater. I don't know if anybody reads Something Positive, but that is a really, really great webcomic by Randy Milholland that has run for over 20 years. That's a fantastic one. I got my start in webcomics. My first comic, I started when I was 15. I made a Kingdom Hearts sprite comic. I took those sprites from the Game Boy Advance game, and with Microsoft Paint, I didn't even have Photoshop. With Microsoft Paint, I would put them together in these little 4-panel strips. Please don't look it up. It was shot comedy made by a 15-year-old in the 2000s, raised on Chappelle's Show in South Park. It did not age well.
And you were making this for Sprite, the drink?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Sprite comics?
You know Sprite Comics, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I knew there's okay. Late in the convention. So like that was my first start. Was, you know, I did that I made 700 of these Kingdom Hearts little on a reality show, dumb little strips, but like it was great practice for dialogue. You know, I didn't have original backgrounds. I had characters with pixelation too low to have expression, so they just had some like rote body language poses. So the only thing that was original and the only way to really communicate any tone was solely through dialogue, which I can now look back on and be like, yeah, that was some pretty spectacular training in that regard.
Yeah, I think probably many people in this panel and maybe many people in the audience will relate to the fact that we all went to webcomics looking for queer stories that we couldn't yet find in the bookstore or the library, especially when I was a teenager. And I was like so hungry for like any scrap, any crumb of a queer narrative. And I definitely went online to find that stuff. And a lot of some of the earliest queer comics are people upstairs are they're still upstairs and they're making comics, even if it's like much different. Like we abandoned the early web series, but they're doing something else now. So
there's a webcomic. I don't know if anyone. There's one of those classic little Keen Spot type comics. I don't know if you've ever heard called Misfile, where an angel misfiled somebody's identity and a boy just wakes up suddenly and is a girl and. Read that for a while, and I was like, oh, wouldn't that be interesting if that happened to you? I wonder what that would be like.
Now, I know that everyone here has, in some way, put into their comics representation of their own gender identity, or at least exploration of gender. So I'd love to know how your gender experience has influenced the way that you write your characters, both queer and otherwise.
I feel like growing up, I was mostly introduced to a lot of coming out stories or coming to terms with your identity stories. And my experience was much slower. It was less like a jump into water and more of like wading in and out. And in coming out in some facets of my life and coming out in other ways and then retreating back. So I think when I'm now writing my queer characters, I want to hone in on specific slower details of what's happening. Like for Transphoria, I was writing about the hormone replacement therapy aspect and the trials of having to go through all the misinformation that's out there. And I think my gender experience has helped me slow down with how I want to create characters, create a story, and what I want an audience to get out of it. So it's been helpful not just to like get to know who the character is, but the pacing of the theme, what I want to actually be portraying.
For me, I definitely, a lot of the ways that I kind of started figuring things out, or the ways I came about the terminology that helped me, was, a lot of it came from stories, movies, comics, shows, what have you. And as much as real people in my life have been very impactful, fiction was very much a way that I kind of came to start understanding my identity, and that's kind of turned into a bit of a recurring theme of some of my writing. Very much the case for Campbell, for Elle and Elle Campbell. A character who had no idea what non-binary was until until the star of their favorite TV show became, was non-binary. And I kind of also just in the story I made for Transphoria, but just people kind of finding themselves in stories, and both the power and frankly the limitations of that has ended up kind of becoming a recurring, I think, motif in my work.
I think being non-binary and like figuring out what your gender means to yourself often, when you don't fall in those pre-existing categories, you start comparing to what you thought was automatic and should be associated with like either your gender or biological sex, and realizing there's so much that is like a system that you kind of just go through, and then once you have one or more identities outside of it, you feel like you're really questioning your relationship to a lot of things that you're like, is that even actually like, it doesn't sound like it should be related to gender, but actually it really is. It'll be a whole pinboard, Pepe Silva pinboard to tell you this, but like this really is connected for me. And so I think even though some stories, many of the stories I write are not necessarily about my characters going through an explicit gender journey, it is still like part of their relationship to they're often going through some kind of system or institution, and their relationship with gender is part of that as well.
I love that, and that of course makes me think of some of the non-human android characters written, but who are so human, and like the emotions are so real. I think for me, writing is a piece of uncovering my identity, and writing is like one of the main tools I have to figure out myself, figure out what's going on with me. And I actually had tried to write a short fictional story about a non-binary junior high student before I wrote genderqueer, and it unfortunately was really unsuccessful. I showed it to a couple of friends and everybody was like, this is not working. And I was like, oh dear. And I think I had written in like some of my own sort of like internalized issues were like not resolved enough to sort of address them in fiction. And that story being so like unsuccessful made me realize like, I think I have to sit down and write about myself, and I have to figure out when I talk about gender, what am I actually saying, and be really clear on what I'm saying and what I mean before I try to reapproach this in fiction, which is part of why I felt like I needed to write a memoir, was just to like figure out what my actual stance was.
Yeah. So much of Elle Campbell was just me writing this and just being like, damn, what might it have been like? What would I maybe have been like if I had figured my shit out at 12 instead of 28?
There's so many stories I read from when I was like in high school or junior high where I'm like, oh, this was a trans story before I realized this was a trans story. And that's what happened with the bi-visibility story. I wrote about a vampire who can't see a reflection. It was very much a dysphoria story. And that was a story I wrote when I was 16, and they were not trans at the time. And I'm reading it again when I found it. I was like, oh, there's some deeper layers here. And I was able to workshop it again. But looking back, it's always interesting to see how much you didn't know and what you know now.
Now, I noticed kind of a recurring theme of us not really seeing the stories we needed when we were figuring ourselves out at that young age. And I think a lot of us had to project ourselves onto the media we did have, or like find allegory, even if it wasn't intended. And I'd be curious to hear, like, within the realm of comics or other just nerd media, like what intended or unintended queer or trans narratives, like, really drew you to them. And I'd also like to explore how other creators can avoid falling into the common pitfalls of things like this, like using monsters as metaphors or mutants as minorities, and failing where so many of those often do in trying to represent us.
Well, in terms of the series that I like for,
The story that's unintendedly very trans.
Ranma Half.
Oh,
I really like Ranma Half. There was, I don't know, no one's gonna know this, but there was an old series, Dragon Knights, that I read in the school library growing up, where in the first like 2 chapters, the main characters cross-dressed for plot reasons like 3 times. And that really changed my psyche, I think.
Yeah, I just have to reiterate the Ranma. I mean, it's so trans. It's so trans. And
very,
I do
very
not think
trans.
that was the author's intended message, but it's what we received. And then, yeah, I mean, I definitely related to like every single story of any female character, who dressed up as a boy, generally to try to like either, study as a knight or access some sort of job or career that was not open to the character and their birth gender. So Alana, the Tamora Pierce series, huge. And then just like every single other version of that narrative ever. But of course, to me, it's always very disappointing that at the end of the book, the character doesn't go, oh, and now I have a realization about my identity and who I am. They all only generally sort of go back to their birth gender. And sometimes it's like, it's still a good story because it's like, oh, maybe the society has become more progressive and now women are allowed to be knights or doctors or whatever. But I really love, I don't know if people have read The Deep and Dark Blue by Nikki Smith, where Nikki Smith literally took that narrative of like, oh, I have to cross-dress for plot reasons, and then says, oh, and then the character realizes they're trans because of that. And it was like so fulfilling to read that as an adult because I was like, thank you for like closing the circle of this like childhood need for the story to end this way and making the one where it does end that way. Thank you.
I spent my middle school years watching over and over again, But I'm a Cheerleader and Saving Face and stealing every one of my parents' entertainment weeklies that mentioned the L word on the cover. And then I just went like, yep, this is a very normal cis boy thing to do. Nothing to read into here.
Sorry, what was the beginning of your question?
I asked about your favorite intended or like unintended queer or trans
Thank you.
allegory in media.
Just because I mentioned it in the first question, Reanimator is one of those movies that a lot of trans masculine people who love horror like, and it's very much based in Frankenstein. So I think any Frankenstein movie, book, comic book, illustrated version is going to have trans themes unintentionally. There's a lot of trying to get control over the body, recreation. This it borders on obsessive, but the desire for something more control. And I think that's themes I like to touch on and why I love horror so much. And when it comes to the motif you mentioned of monster out of the minority, because I like horror, that's generally a motif I like a lot. I like to see that, and I think. Of course, you don't want to perpetuate any stereotypes, but the best way to go about it, if you are into horror, gothic stories like that, is to just do it sincerely. I think as long as sympathy and earnestness are embedded in it, the people are going to love the monster anyway.
I think on the topic of the monster, to not dehumanize trans characters through that kind of allegory. I'm also someone who's inclined towards stories that take the side of the other. And so I kind of like when monsters are the main character and whatnot. But one, I think, is a classic advice is to have more than one. I think that's an easy start of, characters that have different beliefs on and different relationships to other themes, their own gender and whatnot, to show that there is this variety and this spectrum. And also I want to echo what Daniel said with to really approach writing with empathy, earnestness, and recognizing when this instinct to portray something as an other is coming out and questioning what you're putting into that and what tropes are you falling into in order to is it necessary to portray this flat other as well?
Yeah, I think definitely my favorite examples of those type of stories are where it's so clear that the author is like, this character who is seen by society as monstrous is me. Like, I am this character and I love this character, and I'm going to make you also love this character. And so then like the one in the story, they maybe are otherized, but like the relationship that the narrative has to it is of like this is the beloved character.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always struck by just like when like metaphor is useful and when like there's limitations, because especially, you know, trying to figure out and come to terms with like being non-binary. What I struggled with was this sense of like, well, I don't feel cis, but I'm not sure if I'm a binary trans woman, but those seem to be the only options. And it took a lot of my life just to even know that there was like other options, that there was embracing masculinity and femininity, that there are people who use they, them pronouns because that's what fits best. I mean, it's so funny because, again, so often we're up against censorship or limitations that, depicting, having sci-fi or fantasy as a way to explore that concept, I think can be so useful. But I think it's just very important to pair it with regular, mundane human beings who also identify as non-binary just because it's what they identify and feel the most as. I think there's a risk of, if you rely entirely on metaphor or fantasy sci-fi, and again, in isolation, this doesn't apply to any particular use. This is only in the grand aggregate of representation, that if it's too overwhelmingly fantasy or sci-fi based, I think there's a bit of a risk of saying like, oh, being non-binary is an inhuman experience. It's not something people identify with because it's how they feel. It's because there must be a ghost computer involved somewhere. So I think it's really important to just pair both, to not lean too far into one way or the other, just because, that's the one. There's not a ton of non-binary representation to have too many negative tropes, but that is something I sometimes know is like, again, in isolation, each individual use is totally fine. It's just sometimes it's like, yeah, if you have like, okay, you have 7 non-binary characters, but none of them are just like a human being. What are you saying about humans and non-binary identity now? And so, I don't know, just the use and limits I always try to keep in mind. I made like this whole sci-fi book, and honestly, it was one of the things where I had the whole script written, the artist was working on it, the character had one set of pronouns, and then I figured out my shit and figured out I was non-binary, and 2 days later, emailed out the artist and I'm like, hey, this character's non-binary now.
Kim, I really like what you said about making sure there's like not just one instance of like representation stories, and I think that's been something that I've really noticed helps determine like how drawn to a queer piece of media I'm gonna feel. Like, is this a case where there's only one character like that and it's just all about like, gee, it sure sucks to be different, or do we see, like how it usually is in real life, that there's usually not just one queer person. They usually are friends with other queer people or have some sense of queer community, or they find that as they grow older. And I think that's been really important to me as I navigate, like, okay, what kind of queer media do I want to recommend to people when they ask, like, what should I be looking toward and what should there be? Like, I think when reasonable or whenever possible, there needs to be some representation of trans joy or like joy in community and what it's like, not just to realize you're different, but to be able to celebrate yourself because of that.
One of my hopes is that we'll get to a world where there's so much queer stories out there that it no longer really constitutes as a genre in and of itself, or instead of someone being like, oh, I need to find queer stories, someone be like, oh, I want a comedy. Look at all these queer comedies. I want an action movie. Look at all these great queer action movies. Like, and we'll just be like, because we deserve to see ourselves and tell our stories in every genre and tone under the sun. And I look forward to the day when we've told ourselves in every genre there is to tell.
Now, jumping on that, like what you hope to see in the future with queer and trans media and finding it like multiple examples in multiple genres. I would like to know what you hope that people draw specifically from your works or the way that you've represented queer and trans identities in your comics and novels and even other works you've just contributed to.
I think the main thing for me is that I try to communicate that you don't have to have it all figured out and you don't need to find a specific label. You can just move towards whatever brings you joy. And that any kind of identity, whether actually you still identify as cis, but I hope that every single person explores different ways you can present in your gender, and whether that's fashion or pronouns or community or hairstyles or creative expression, and just treat it like a buffet of life and just pick out all of your favorite, most tastiest little morsels and make a collection of everything that you love, and don't worry so much about it fitting into any specific label or box.
I think for my work as writing about like topics that are different, but trying to include queerness as like very normal or like standard, despite like it doesn't all for my work, it doesn't always have to be the A plot. So portraying characters with many different relationships to their own gender, being on different plot points on the spectrum of gender, and so it's the normalization, and then also on a thematic point going back to this idea of the other and recognizing that like to see yourself in an other, even if people don't look or choose to present in the same way as you, to still find that mirror in them.
I would say if someone's reading like my own queer work and what I hope they take away from it, I would say, I guess it depends on the audience. If it's an audience that already knows who they are and what they're all about, I just want them to have a good time with a story that sees them and puts them front and center. If they're questioning and trying to figure out, especially stuff like my novel, Elle, Campbell, I really hope it offers a path, maybe some answers. I hope it's the kind of story that probably would have helped me figure out a lot of stuff. And maybe for your well-meaning straight readers who, God bless them, they got the spirit, but they're, and they want to do their part, I would say, I hope from my work that they take away a recognition that, the coming out and the figuring out what you are isn't the end of the story. It's really the beginning of it.
Yeah, similar to that in a few things. I think anyone reading it, if you are questioning, I think it's good to hear one trans experience, one trans voice, especially because I feel like in comics and all media, trans characters are usually side characters, one-off characters, not really given the main platform. So seeing them as main characters, getting that voice, at least get you into one side of an experience of what it means to come to terms with one's identity, what is involved in any sort of transitioning process. I think also in most of the things I write, I would hope any audience, whether they're cis or trans, would see that trans people can belong in any genre. We talked a lot about genre already, but just seeing how well trans themes can fit into other genres thematically, horror, fantasy, sci-fi, there are so many fun elements to play with there that you can have fun with a trans character who's out as trans and it's part of their identity explicitly, but also you could play off of the fun elements that are there. So I think that's what I enjoyed about seeing a lot of webcomics, that endless possibilities, endless opportunities to do strange things that anybody could come up with. And I would hope somebody could see that reflected in what I would write or create.
I know this is outside comics, this is more television. As much of a fucking motherfucker as the past couple of years has been for our community, I have been a little heartened on TV seeing more trans actors getting chances to not just play trans actors, but just to get not just trans characters, but to just get to show their talent and what they, She-Hulk had an episode where a trans woman is getting married and no attention is ever raised that she's trans. It's just an incredibly funny actress who is cast as the bride in this. Kobe in the live action One Piece is played by a trans man, played to perfection. So I am heartened that, at least on that side, we are seeing more people just be recognized and get opportunities for their immense talent and not just those rare scraps when something fits our identity.
Let's see, Ben and Dan, both your answers kind of touched on the target audience and what they're looking for and what they see in your work. So I think this makes that as good a time as any to open the floor to audience questions. Folks just want to raise your hand or shout something out, feel free to get rowdy. But any takers on questions?
Okay, so as a queer creator, I would love to explore more characters exploring their own gender, but in the sense that you don't want to take away space with other trans queer creators writing these characters. So at the same time, you don't want to have to influence your own gender identity. You know, more how do you go about exploring things that allow you to disclose your own per se issue or anything like that, and not take space with other martialist creators?
Oh, I'm probably bad for this because I posted damn near every photo of my social transition online. Couldn't stop shutting up about that.
Yeah, I obviously think that people of any identity should and can and do write trans characters very well. And it just comes down to doing your research. And if perhaps you have some of that in your identity as well, even if you don't want to be public about it, maybe the research is very close to home and is pretty easy, actually. But yeah, I know there's a real push for own voices stories, which I do think are really important. But sort of the flip side of own voices, especially in the queer community, is that it has sort of forced some authors to come out before they were ready to do so. And that's a real bummer. And that's why we should just take people writing any identity at good faith and not, make them show receipts or something, but just say, did this character relate? Did I as a reader relate to this character, whether or not the author seems to share the identity, and try to leave it at that and not poke into people's personal lives.
Well said about taking people at face value. I don't know how familiar people are with the Isabel Fell, what happened with her. So I think we, as a community, creators and readers have a responsibility to take people at face value and, work to make sure we don't let that happen to another creator. And I think I also want to emphasize, this is you doing a story doesn't subtract somebody else's story. That this is additive. You adding your voice does not silence anyone else's voice. So don't feel like your crafting stories takes away from somebody. That we are in community and collaborative, and it is a big pool, and the water's fine.
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, and I know I've heard this advice repeated countless times elsewhere, but having some level of trusted sensitivity reader, or if you feel like you're writing about something that's out of your conscious lived experience, have someone you trust that would be more informed on that. Give it a read and give it feedback. It by no means has to be the person in your life, but just someone who you trust their feedback, or they have the same goals in mind for the art you're trying to create. And I've noticed too, as I've been running the show and meeting a lot of cis creators that have done great jobs, celebrating the trans community or celebrating trans people in comics, I think that word is the thing to focus on, celebrating it, and not just writing as this is something that is afflicting a person, but just a condition of this person, and a lot of other things happen that have nothing to do with that. This is just a state of being for a character.
Okay. Hi. I'm curious to know how, it's kind of connected to the earlier question regarding your gender experience influencing your narratives, but how does your gender experience in transness influence your world building? like the way you are portraying a world and the way that your contemplation on gender, on transness, on fluidity is experienced by non-trans characters.
I know I have the least published comics experience on this, but y'all mind if I take the lead here? So I have a comic on Kickstarter right now that it's taking everything I loved growing up and kind of exploring how discovering one's own identity affects those around you. It's called When We Transform. It's very Power Rangers inspired because that's what I loved. And that's ultimately what I want to do, is tell trans and queer related experiences through the realm of things that look like Power Rangers. I think it's important to focus on like how this will affect people other than one character. How does this affect family members? How does this affect their world and like how they approach it? Not to say like, oh yeah, let's just explore all these negatives, but more like, oh hey, this is going to change some things. It's going to change how this person navigates the world. It's going to change how they approach certain relationships. It raises a big question of how they break a certain major piece of news to other people. And hey, if you don't like your initial character design, it gives you a real good opportunity to do a second chance at that. So yeah, I'd say just like really put yourself in the shoes of that character and think of like, what are the tough conversations that would have to be had? And maybe even more importantly, like, what would it be like to be someone on the other side of some kind of sci-fi, fantasy, or even slice of life trans-related situation for whatever fits the story?
For the original question is about gender expression affecting world building, right? So I don't always have this explicitly in my work, but I feel like it's often, I like it as like a little extra point to figure out like a character's relationship with maybe a theme that's going on, or some other categories that they have relationships to. So, and that doesn't always make it into the text, for me at least. But for example, for my graphic novel, the main characters are magical, they're like pop idol magical girls, fighting for a corporation. And so they are, the premise of this world building is that they are tools for this company. And so how I write them is that everything is, they're constructed for this job, right? And so actually they personally do not have a relationship to their own gender, because they are not like manufactured to think about that. So that's like, and that's, I feel like thinking about that as like an option of like, not just what gender are they, but like what kind of relationship do they have to that? If you're a tool for a corporation, maybe you're not allowed to have a relationship with yourself and your own identity. And so that manifests as like, it's not so much my gender is girl, so much as my job is magical girl, is how I personally think about that story for myself.
I mean, as someone who spends way too much of their life as a tool for a corporation, no, you are not allowed to have a relationship with your gender. Unfortunately, the nail polish comes off on Monday.
Yeah.
I don't have any published sci-fi or fantasy or speculative work yet, so I haven't been able to show this in my own writing. Actually, well, at least at the book length. But I wanted to mention two different novels that I think that doing this really interestingly, and one is the Ancillary Justice series by Anne Leckie, where there's a whole empire of people who don't think gender is very important, and also take like an implant that basically is like a birth control type implant that they only turn off very specifically if they want to have children later on. So it kind of just like neutralizes a lot of gender stuff for the majority of the characters' lives. And every single character in this empire uses she, her pronouns, but I wouldn't say it in it's a way that they all identify as feminine. It's just that that's the neutral pronoun of people. And it's kind of like nobody thinks about gender very much. And then people outside the empire think that they're total weirdos for doing this, but because it's from this character's point of view, it's normalized like within the society that you're reading about, which I think is very, very cool. Oh my gosh, I forget. Obviously Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness is like a classic. I had another example now and then it slipped away. Do you?
Kind of related, there's since writing my own sci-fi book, I went back to kind of discover more sci-fi prose that I found interest in. And I haven't read Left Hand of Darkness yet. I really need to. But there's a whole like category of books. You read like 3 pages and you're like, that they love Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness. And so Ancillary Justice, that series was a lot of fun. I really like the Murderbot Diaries, which is a novella series, and the main character is is a tool of a corporation, and
so the author is Martha Wells. If anybody's looking down at home, and the main character uses like its pronouns very deliberately, and is like, do not put gender on me. Gender is very gross.
It's like about their relationship to this idea of being human. And in like, they want to be a person, they're trying to find agency, but are they human? To be quick. I think, there's another one, but I can't remember.
I just had another example, but it fell out of my head. So if other people keep talking, maybe it'll return to me.
Just about the world building aspect, just some way more general writing advice for anything that pops up where it's like, oh God, that's part of the story now. You kind of just advice is to reframe how you think of it and use it as an opportunity. Like, oh, now I get to expand this and think about this new world in a new way, and all stories are driven by conflict. So how you want to play with that, it doesn't have to be our world equivalent, but what's this new way we could think about it to make the story either more interesting, or add something to a character, add something unique that makes you excited to write it. It shouldn't be something that like drags you down or that you dread, which is very easy when you are when you succumb to writer's block a lot. So reframe that to an opportunity is my general advice for most things.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That sparked a lot of really good answers. What other questions do we have?
Getting to the point you were covering about metaphor versus explicit queerness, obviously it's over time hopefully easier to be explicit and use actual terms, but where do you think there's still like special, unique value in either metaphors or subtext without going all the way to
I think there's always value in it. I just think it's just a measure of balance. I think even things that you can be explicit about, there might still be great power in metaphor and the wider applicability or ability to create understanding. I think it's just a matter of making sure you got more than just a hammer in your toolbox so every problem doesn't look like a nail.
Yeah, I'm thinking of another example. It's outside of comics, but a young adult novel called Out of Salem by Hal Shreve, who also has just successfully kickstarted a comic too that I'm excited to read. But this book it's like a teen, it's like a teen coming of age story, but the main character is non-binary, and they are also they recently died in a car accident and were revived with sort of a zombie-like spell. And they're still going through their day-to-day life, but with their body actively decomposing while they try to continue living in it. And it is very much a metaphor for gender dysphoria. And it is so successful. Like, I read that and I was like, yes, sometimes you feel so horrible. It feels like your body is rotting around you, but you still have to go to school and you still have a crush on a hot werewolf girlfriend and etc. And it's both explicit and a metaphor, because the character is non-binary and uses they them pronouns in the story and is misgendered by their surviving family members. So it's not subtext, it is text, but then the metaphor is there to kind of show both be relatable to a reader who can relate to it, and then maybe an interesting window into an experience for a reader who doesn't relate to it, of this is the visceralness of this feeling. So that's a book that I think does both. It's metaphor, it's text and subtext, and it fits together really nicely.
Yeah.
So no surprise, the author is trans, so they know what they were talking about.
I think a risk in making things and not making things literal and explicit is that you open up the possibility of people, especially maybe people from outside the community, whether accidentally or even willfully not understanding the message. I remember I watched Matrix Resurrections and walked out there going like, wow, that was the most blatantly non-binary movie of all time. Like, sure, they didn't say it, but come on, like, but these characters are coded as non-binary. They talk about breaking a game called Binary. The movie is about Neo being a non-binary sapphic. And I remember watching them, I'm like, this movie felt like it was delivering all those messages with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. And then I'd go on YouTube and see some like straight boy film essayists going like, I don't get this movie. What was it trying to say? I don't really understand I didn't really pick up on it. I'm like, what was the message in Trinity's prison being this heteronormative marriage? What were they trying to say with that? I don't get it.
Yeah, I think kind of touching on Maya and Kim's answer, like I've really felt drawn to stories that rather than being a full-on allegory of like this is this, it's more the intersection of like how does being trans interact with this. Like Blue Delaconte is a great webcomic called Oh Human Star that explores like being trans and also being an android, and that gives opportunities to talk about certain things like clocking other people. Like androids can identify other people really easy, but it also affects the way they interact with their own gender. And I think that's a subtle thing that can lead to a lot of problems if it's missing, like when it's just, okay, yeah, minorities are mutants or something, like instead of interacting, well, what's it like to be a trans mutant? What's it like to be a mutant of color? So it's like, okay, well, minorities are mutants and also mutants can blow up a school by accident. Like there's a reason people are afraid of them. And so I think just finding like, okay, this isn't the replacement thing. This just gives us something that adds an interesting way to explore this element of a character or a world.
Yeah, that's where you get like the limits, where in so much like mutant is a very useful metaphor. But if you take it too far, you'd be like, okay, but we would be a little different about people that could blow up like people's heads with their eyes, right? Like, no, in terms of something that I think struck a really great balance that uses both a metaphorical concept, in this case it's androids, but also treats feelings of gender identity very explicitly and literally. I really recommend a comic Made in Korea written by Jeremy Holt, who is a non-binary writer. It's a heavy book. It deals with some very intense themes, so something that comes with a very strong content warning for that, but that is a book that uses the metaphor of a robot child, but uses that to explicitly explore being transgender and gender identity. So like, it starts with the metaphorical, but then uses that to springboard into the literal.
I'll recommend something that sounds like it's on the opposite end of like safe for children spectrum, which is the Batcat series by Maggie Ram. There's 2, I think, out so far, and it's about a little pink round creature that is half bat, half cat, and it lives on a little magical, whimsical island, and like has to solve little problems like a ghost is eating all of my food. What do I do about that? And this Batcat, especially in the first book, goes on this little journey and encounters both cats and bats, both of who say, like, you don't fit in our little group, and has to really be like, who am I and where do I fit? And then comes to realize, like, I can be equally a bat and a cat and have a good time. And the author is non-binary. This is very much like, it's another one of those where it's like, it's a metaphor because it's 2 animals, but then the character also, again, uses they, them pronouns, is written by a non-binary author, and is very much written for young non-binary readers, like we're talking like 6-8-year-olds, to have a character that they can relate to, and also maybe practice using pronouns for a character in a book. And like, it's again working on kind of, I would say, really successfully on 2 levels.
Yeah, I think it's important as early readers just introduce that there are these options and the pronouns. I mean, when I was doing Elle Campbell, the full title is Elle Campbell Wins Their Weekend. And that was something I was very insistent on, is I want a they, them pronoun in the title. Yeah. I want it to be undeniable. Not that it stopped assholes on Goodreads from misgendering the main character throughout the review, but at least I feel like, well, you did this intentionally. There's no way you could have missed what the whole big book about being non-binary uses they, them pronouns.
I think we have time for probably one more question before we wrap up. Actually, we'll make time for two. Casper, you want to go first?
I find often hard, especially in modern very political society, we really get feminism and trans issues pitted against each other, and this is unfortunate. So I'm wondering if, as writers and creators, you have experience trying to maintain a true intersectionality whilst dealing with this weird political system. If you have any experience with that directly, trying to make sure that stories still feel genuine to more binary, sound-interesting people, but also include the trans ones that we all know experience directly.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely know that, like, just in my personal level, I became a feminist when I came out as non-binary. And so for me, feminism and trans rights are completely interlinked. And I try to represent that as best as I can in my work. And I briefly mentioned a short story that wasn't working before I wrote Genderqueer. It was because I hadn't figured that out yet. I wrote a story that was trying to be from a AFAB non-binary perspective, and it was riddled with like trans misogyny because I hadn't figured my shit out, because I was including my sort of negative experiences with femininity without acknowledging that like femininity is like a beautiful, powerful gift for many, just not one that suited me. And so then I wrote a second little comic called Gifts, which is about wanting to give away sort of the pieces of femininity that I was born with, but acknowledging that they are like very good and like powerful things that I wish I could like hand to someone who really wanted them. And so they would be like valued, not like thrown away as like discarded as like unimportant. And I think writing that comic helped me sort out, like, so that by the time I got to like writing my memoir, I was like, okay, I know what I'm saying, which is that we're not trying to like throw away pieces of gender because we think they're like bad. It's that we're trying to find the ones that give us joy, and we're trying to move towards joy and away from sort of like control and shame. So that's sort of like what I've come to in my work. And I hope that I include this in all of my fictional work as well. But I really kind of feel like I worked it out in my memoir stuff, and I hope to show it in my fiction in the future.
I think the question is really interesting with like, it's definitely a topic that I is a bit adjacent to a project I'm starting to like develop with this idea of femininity. And I guess my angle on it with my personal work is to how people's relationship with their femininity, how that can express different relationships with where else they feel like they fit in the world. So a hyper feminine character that might that expression of hyper femininity might tie into feeling like she needs to perform a role elsewhere, and this is how that's expressed. I kind of lost my train of thought, so I let other people talk and not take up too much time.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, I guess I come from a more trans feminine angle of my experiences. So, usually if I'm exploring my own identity or something like that, it's usually coming at it from an angle of embracing femininity and trying to become more feminine. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer. This one, I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah, just in my experience and my own ways of working through things, I think so much trans misogyny just hurts trans women. It hurts cis women. I think writers need to take more of the opportunity and more of the time to understand the harm that trans misogyny does to all people. I think a lot of trans misogyny ends up reducing cis women and trans women down to body parts that I feel like contradict a lot of beliefs that they think they have. And there are so many great comics that exist that support trans women, include trans women in the themes that they deal with the power that comes with like womanhood, girlhood bonds between women, and how it ties to the story. Two very different stories I'm thinking of are N.D. Stevenson wrote Lumberjanes along with other artists and writers that names are escaping me right now, but there is a trans character in this group of girls. And then the other one I was thinking of was Safe Sex by Tina Horn. A lot of casually trans and queer characters all working together in a kind of like dystopian conservative society. And they portray, trans women and cis women and all kinds of gender representations just together in a way that supports queer rights, trans rights, sex workers' rights. And it supports the story, it aids the story. And I think if you approach writing marginalized characters in a way that doesn't do that, you're ultimately doing harm to all sorts of causes.
Really quickly, something that I thought of is that often when feminism and feminism meets trans misogyny, they're usually treating a certain trait as sacred and untouchable, and that is really worth investigate. If you run into that as a writer, I think that's really worth investigating narratively, but also your own feelings. I feel like a lot of my work looks at like systems and institutions and stuff, and so naturally that kind of marries into each other of like, this is seen as so natural and so sacred. Let's examine that. Let's really think about that.
Now, last question towards the back.
Yeah, so I want to ask, because of how COVID kind of changed how people meet and interact, where do creators kind of go to find other creators nowadays to like collaborate and help each other? Because there's got to be a better place than Twitter and just meeting at conventions.
As far as like networking and finding other creators within the trans community, Blue Sky has been a really good alternative to Twitter so far. I'd really recommend that just from my own personal experience. I know that's where some people on this panel are often most active. Also, as for like finding collaborators, there's a number of subreddits you can look into that you have to be kind of sharp because sometimes they get overrun with bots and scammers. But like I found artists on Reddit like r/comic collabs or hungry artists. Just look into people's past work. But yeah, there's certainly communities out there, and those are the two I'd first start with.
There are a lot of Discord groups out there. I mean, there are a lot of Discord groups in general, but I find that with social media kind of scattering, Discord groups seem to be more popular. Maybe it's among just like a certain demographic, but I've definitely seen a lot of people there. At the very least, I'm part of the Cartoonist Co-op as an example. And I'm sure there are gender and trans specific groups that you can find. It is a little bit of a hassle that it's like you have to join the group before you can see anything and see if it's your vibe. But that's the times right now.
Yeah, I would second the Cartoonist Co-op Discord, which I'm also a part of, and it has about 1,000 members at this point, and it's trying to do some of the work that a union could do, but it's so hard to unionize comics because we're such a scattered freelancing-based field. But there's a lot of resources. They're trying to build things like discounts on, say, like self-printing companies for members, and there's a lot of people asking, technical questions, advice on things, and I don't know that there's a specific place where people are actively trying to find collaborators, but I think just being active in a space like that and sort of getting to know people from chit-chatting, you might realize that you have common interests or common creative goals with someone, and then maybe you can sort of take it into the DMs and see if you have the time and interest in making a project.
There's been a lot of really great and wonderful queer and trans comic anthologies lately, and so those are a lot of people who are starting out, making names, putting out like some of their first work, and again, that's whole anthologies full of queer and trans creators, and this is a community where most people in this business are really friendly, no matter how much we're shut-in nerds. We really are friendly. So, really like check out some of those anthologies. Look up who the creators involved are, where they're at. I mean, that's these anthologies are kind of nice, built-in rosters of community of people that are on the same journey you are, both in terms of queerness and in creating.
If you've got a few friends, also start a project of your own. I co-ran an anthology, a gay girl, gay vibes anthology with my former roommates. And so that's been going on. Glimmer.
Yeah, as someone who's really bad at keeping up with social media, finding those like Discord groups, the small communities you could find, and also conventions are a great place. You can probably ask anyone who's here for a business card or where you can find them online for more direct contact, but try to stay as active on social media as possible because that is a really good way to connect with people.
Yeah, unfortunately, social media and conventions are really good ways to meet people.
Now, in our last few minutes here, I just wanted to give our panelists all a chance to plug their own ongoing and upcoming work. So, starting with Daniel, what do we got in the near future, or what do we got that's available now?
Transphoria, it was a Kickstarter campaign. You could still get it now. You can find it by just Googling Transphoria Kickstarter. It's an anthology. It has 17 different trans stories of different genres, so I definitely recommend checking that out. And I do that through Lifeline Comics, and there are new campaigns almost every month that you should go check out for that too, also on Kickstarter.
And I have a story in that. I have a story about how JoJo's Bizarre Adventures made me gay. You can find me at benconcomics.com, Bencon Comics on Instagram and Blue Sky. Blue Sky is where I spend most of my time social media-wise. I co-host the Progressively Horrified podcast, where we review and analyze horror movies through the lens of progressive politics and themes. New episodes every Friday. And then my next graphic novel is currently available for pre-order. Mr. Muffins, Defender of the Stars from Oni Press is about a young boy dragged into an intergalactic war when he discovers that the cosmic spirit of light has been reborn as his pet corgi.
You can find me at social media at Kimberley, KMBRLEI at most sites except for Twitter, which is Raven and Blue. And you can find my book of Thunder and Lightning in bookstores and through the Silver Sprocket website.
You can also find my book in bookstores, which is so great. Genderqueer, a Memoir is my first book. I have this one out. Breathe, Journeys to Healthy Binding was a short nonfiction book about chest binding as an aspect of transmasculine healthcare, but more generally about thinking about ways that you can transition that are gentle on your body, but positive for your mind. I'm working on a third book that'll be out someday. And you can find me at Red Gold Sparks on Instagram and Tumblr, which is my favorite social media. Or you can Google me.
And if you don't mind a little self-plug, my own first very trans comic, When We Transform, is currently live on Kickstarter. We're about 80% funded at the moment. So thank you. Yeah, feel free to check us out. We're doing some cool stuff. We have a color-changing special edition of our comic book that no one's done before. And we could use some help hitting that 100% goal. But otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Dan, Ben, Kim, Maya, you've all been incredible, and I've loved your answers.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yeah. And one last thank you to the audience for sharing your questions. If you want to check out our past episodes, you can find us online as Transcending Comics. We're on most social media sites and podcasting platforms. So, we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Yeah. Nervous.